Good afternoon. I'm Gina Warner. I am a real estate broker and a managing broker with Red One Realty. I'm here tonight to follow up on Contract Training 101, which I started a week or so ago. And I'm going to do Contract Training 102 tonight, and there will be at least probably 2 more installments in this series of contract trainings. The contract is very complex. It takes a lot to understand it and to be able to explain it to your clients. So we're going to take our time. We're going to go through this paragraph by paragraph so that you can understand it. I do not have a live audience with me tonight because this is a re-record, but if you have questions, you can reach out to me at any time and I'll be happy to answer them for you, or of course, any of the other leaders of AM. I'm going to start by just doing a little quiz on some of the things that we talked about last week. And without anyone here to answer, I'm going to give the questions and then I'm going to come back and do all the answers. And if you're just watching the recording, that'll give you a chance to think through the questions and see if you can come up with the answers before I give them to you. Okay, the first question is, how much time should you allot to share with the contract with a buyer or seller, to share the contract with a buyer or seller? I discussed last week about being able to share this with a buyer or seller before they sign it. So approximately how much time should you allot for yourself to do that? If you want to write your answers down and check them when I go back through, you could do that. Question 2 is a true or false question. If you need to write in a term in the additional terms section of the contract document, should you try to sound as lawyer-like as possible? True or false? You should try to sound as lawyer-like as possible. What do you think about that? Question number 3. What should you use as a guide for yourself when you're trying to write in additional terms into the contract? What should you use as a guide? Question 4. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to include a pre-approval or a proof of funds letter with your buyer's offer when you submit it to the listing agent? Question number 5. If you're representing a buyer, what would you tell them is the first contingency in the contract that would allow them to get out if there's an issue? The first contingency for a buyer in order of the way the contract is written. Question number 6. How can a loan commitment timeframe help a buyer? And part B of the same question, how can a loan commitment timeframe hurt a buyer? Question number 7. What is the second buyer contingency in the contract in the order the contract is written? The second contingency that protects a buyer. Question number 8. Who is helped by the demand for financing evidence paragraph in the contract? Who is helped by the demand for financing evidence paragraph? And question number 9. Explain how a tax proration works in the state of Ohio and why we need it. Okay, back to question 1. How much time should you allot to share the contract with buyers or sellers? And I told you last week you probably need at least an hour. You want to be able to explain it fully, allow them to ask questions, because your goal as a fiduciary is for them to understand what they're signing and not just sign it because they think they trust you. They need to understand it because there's all kinds of things that can happen during the contract period. If they have a basic understanding of the contract, it's going to help you as an agent. It's going to help them as a buyer or seller to be confident in your abilities as well. Question number 2, true or false? If you need to write in a term, you should try to sound as lawyer-like as possible. That answer is false. I told you last week that the important thing to do is write in plain language. Don't try to use legalese. Don't try to use big words. Don't try to use terms that you think sound fancy. You want it to be clear that you are not an attorney. You don't play one on TV and you're not trying to pretend to be one. Write in plain English with simple words. Number 3, what should you use as a reference guide for writing additional terms into the contract? You should use the additional terms clause that you can find in the dot loop or in the resources page on Red One Agent. So there is a whole document, it's like many pages long, and it has all the commonly written in terms like sale of home contingency, contingent upon buyer finding or seller finding a suitable home. Writing in a term stating that the seller is to pay buyer's closing costs. All the normal things are in there, written out in the legal terms that you can use, cut and paste, copy them right in there. Don't use your own words. If there's a clause available, use that. And if there's not, you write it in plain terms or you ask for help. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to include a proof of funds or pre-approval with your buyer's offer? I would say it's a 10, especially in this competitive market. There's not much inventory. There is little opportunity for your buyer to have much strength to negotiate as far as having lots of different things to look at, just not happening. If your buyer doesn't present a strong offer at the beginning, they're probably not going to get a chance to buy a house. So pre-approval letter, proof of funds, get it in hand before you start showing houses, be able to present it with any offer. Sometimes a lender will give you a generic one that doesn't have a address on it, but it might have a price on it. If you can use that, that's great. Some sellers will require an address specific proof of funds or pre-approval letter, in which case you might have to go back to the lender and say, hey, could you write a pre-approval letter specific to this? But in the meantime, you could use that generic one, especially if it's on a weekend and you can't get a hold of the lender. That's sometimes kind of tricky. I mean, obviously it's best to work with a lender that you can get a hold of them on the weekend, but that's a perfect world and we don't live in a perfect world. And sometimes your buyer will come in with a lender that you don't know or have much communication with, and you're just going to have to figure it out. But do your best to get something in hand that you can use for your buyer to present an offer. Next question, what is the first contingency for a buyer in order of the contract is written? And that would be the financing contingency. It starts at the top of page 2, and it basically says if your buyer can't get their financing, they can get out of the contract, no harm, no foul. First contingency. Question 6, how can a loan commitment timeframe help a buyer? It can help a buyer if you're very confident of your buyer and your lender and you're able to put a short time frame in the loan commitment. It can hurt a buyer if you put a time frame in there that the lender can't meet or the buyer is not able to meet because they may have a more complicated financial situation. So if you put a loan commitment date in there, like say 20 days or 10 days or something like that, and then your lender isn't ready, the buyer hasn't got their act together, then the seller can actually cancel the contract based on the demand for financing evidence, which is connected to the loan commitment. And that's a way for the seller to get out of the contract. So be careful with that loan commitment timeframe. What is the second buyer contingency in order the contract is written? And that would be the appraisal contingency. If the house does not appraise for at or above the purchase price, then the buyer can get out of the contract, no harm, no foul. But of course, we always try to negotiate it if we can, because it's a better result for everyone involved in most cases, if you can pull together a small appraisal gap. If it's a big appraisal gap, may not be able to pull it together. And that's just kind of the way it goes sometimes. Question 8, who does a demand for financing evidence protect? And the answer to that is a clear seller. It protects the seller because it allows the seller to have an avenue by which to put the buyer on a hot seat. If the buyer's not performing, if the lender's not doing their job, if things are not moving along and the deal is languishing, it gives the seller an opportunity to demand information as to what's going on with the financing. And if the buyer's lender can't produce satisfactory information to the seller's satisfaction, the seller has the right to terminate. And question number 9, explain how tax proration works in the state of Ohio. So in the state of Ohio, taxes are paid a year in arrears. So the taxes that you're paying in, say, July 2024 are actually from the second half of 2023. So the county doesn't want you to give them the money early. If you're going to sell your house, you can't just walk into the county auditor and say, hey, here's my taxes for all of 2024 up to August 12th. They don't want it. They won't accept it. They'll tell you to go away. But so what happens is the seller gives the buyer a credit for the amount of taxes accrued that have not been paid yet. Sometimes it's the last half of the previous year and the current year up to the date of closing. Depending on when it falls, it might just be the current year up to the date of closing. If you're toward the end of the year, the second half would have already been paid from the previous year. So the seller gives the buyer a tax proration, a credit in the amount of those taxes, and then the buyer is responsible for paying those taxes when they come due. If it's a cash deal, the buyer would do well to put that money in a savings account and have it available to pay the taxes when the taxes are due. If it's a loan, then the lender will actually take care of that. They will absorb that money into an escrow account and have the money available when it's time to pay the taxes when they come due in the current or next year. Okay, that gets us through our quiz. I hope you did well and got all the answers right. We're going to start on We're going to pick up on the bottom of page 3 of the contract. So here, and we talked about taxes and assessments. We covered all that last week. So we're going to start with 4.2, and that is the community development charge. So a community development charge is going to be something that the seller should know about because they should have been paying if a development charge, if there is one. You'll more than likely find these in the city, not out in the country. You'll normally find them in an HOA, a homeowners association, that has a lot of rules. They could be things like paying for a sidewalk. They could be things like paying for lights on the street. Whatever this development charge is, it's probably on top of the normal homeowners association fees. So the seller should know about the community development charge, or the title company might find the community development charge when they do the title search. You'll see on here that if the seller doesn't cough up the information about the community development charge and that is found during a title search, then the foregoing blanks, if they're not filled in and a development charge is found, the contract may not be enforceable by the seller or binding upon the buyer. So in other words, if the seller did not tell the buyer that there was a community development charge and it's significant, and the buyer finds out about it during the title search and they're not happy about it, they don't want to pay it, then the buyer can actually terminate the contract based on that. And also the seller may decide they don't want to pay anything towards it and they may cancel the contract as well. So all that unknown information, if it crops up, it's being covered here. It gives people an out. One community development charge that I'm aware of that happened a few years back in a Hideaway Hills over in the Hocking Hills. They were repairing their dam. So they have a big lake there and a marina and all this stuff. And it's very, very cool place. But they had a problem with their dam. It was starting to leak and needed maintenance. It was super duper expensive. And so they ended up charging every person that owned a property in there thousands of dollars for this dam development. And it took place over the course of, I think, 5 years. They had 5 years to pay it off. So what happened was during the time period, that 5 year time period, people were paying like $1,000 a year or whatever. If they wanted to sell their house, they had to work this out with the buyer. What happens to that dam development charge? Who's going to pay it? Is the seller going to pay it all up so the buyer doesn't have to worry about it? Is the buyer going to take over payments on it? So that was a community development charge that we had to deal with when we bought and sold houses in Hideaway Hills during that time period, just as an example. Section 4.3, it says the seller warrants that no improvements or services have been installed or furnished or notification received from a public authority or owners association of future improvements of which any part of the cost might be assessed against the premises except the following. So in this case, if there was a dam development in this one, you could write, dam improvement fee on here and how much it is. The other thing that this covers is in case the seller had work done and they never actually paid for the work to be done, then that's something that could become a lien against the property. And so obviously a buyer would want to know about that. So it's the seller's responsibility to make sure that there is nothing against the property other than what they note here. And if they put something on here on a note, then the buyer needs to agree to it. So what can happen in the situation is, because you as a buyer's agent aren't going to know probably anything about 4.2 or 4.3. So as a listing agent, when you get an offer and you're reviewing it with your seller, you need to make sure that you get this information from them if there is anything. Make sure they understand that if there's a community development charge, they need to disclose it right now. There is also a place for that on the property disclosure. They make sure they understand that if there is an improvement that hasn't been paid for, they need to note it on here and advise the buyer. And that if they don't put anything on here, they are warranting or guaranteeing or promising or giving a covenant that no improvements or services have been provided that haven't been paid for. So make sure your seller is aware of and understanding this section. Section 5, fixtures and equipment, is probably the biggest thing that people get into issues about on the contract. The reason being, a lot of it has to do with expectations. So this section tries to bring together the expectations of the buyer versus the expectations of the seller. What is the seller expecting to leave? What is the buyer expecting to gain when they walk in the house after closing? Is the chandelier there that they were expecting to be there, or has it been removed and replaced with something cheaper? So that's what you need to make sure that your buyer understands, that generally all these things listed out here, which has grown over time, these are generally included with the home sale. They go with the house. But if there's a change to that, then your buyer might want to write it in, or the seller might want to counter with it. One example I have is a chandelier that was in a house that I was selling one time, and it was like a $20,000 chandelier that the seller, Mr., had purchased for the seller, Mrs., when they were on a trip to Italy one time. And they had it up in their house. It was gorgeous. And we put in the listing that it was not transferring and that the seller would replace it with another chandelier. Well, that was all well and good, and we got that written down in the contract that the seller would replace it. But the problem was the chandelier was just so beautiful that whenever we replaced the $20,000 chandelier with the $500 chandelier, the buyer was extremely disappointed in the chandelier choice and felt like something nicer should be there. Looking back, that was probably my mistake. I should have probably told the seller, take the chandelier down and replace it before we list the house. Because what happened was it increased the buyer's expectations for what the dining room was going to look like with that gorgeous chandelier. And I mean, it was really beautiful. And then it was replaced with a very plain Jane chandelier that then just did not give the room the same effect that it had before. And this was probably be $1 million house now. It was several years ago, and it was we sold it in the 600 range, but I'm sure it would probably be close to $1 million house now. So this wasn't, a $100,000 house chandelier. This was a really, really nice place. And the chandelier made a big difference in that room. So it's all about managing expectations. A couple things that people often ask about. One is media brackets. So attached media brackets are the fourth one down here, excluding televisions and other components attached to the brackets. So the media brackets that are screwed into the walls, they should stay with the house. If you don't want to leave them with the house, have the seller, if the seller doesn't want to leave them, have them take them down before you list the house, and fill the holes, as they can leave some pretty big holes. Otherwise, the brackets stay, the televisions go. So the televisions are a personal item that's not permanently attached to the wall, but the brackets are permanently attached with screws to the wall. And basically, that's kind of the deciding factor. I heard someone say, if you can pick the house up and turn it upside down, anything that doesn't fall to the ceiling is something that goes with the seller when they leave. So anything that's not attached. Things that are attached, like attached mirrors that are screwed into the wall-to-wall carpeting, of course, kitchen and bath fixtures, built-in appliances, central vac systems, all these things stay with the house. Curtain rods that are screwed in stay with the house, but the window coverings, they would go with the seller. They do not transfer. But of course, anytime you want to make a change to that, you can write it in down here. So the most common things written in are kitchen appliances, I've seen on the MLS, other examples such as garage or basement fridge, washer, dryer, bar stool, swing set. They encourage you not to include personal property that has significant value, such as a pool table or a riding mower, because many times what will happen is the lender will make you write that out of the contract anyway. They don't want things in the contract that are considered chattel and that they could add value, but it's an inflated value to the house. So you can't account for that. Another one is hot tubs. Hot tubs can be really expensive, but if they don't really usually want to see those written into the contract because they are still considered chattel, a personal property. So my goal in this section would be just to tell you to always over communicate everything. If it's written in the MLS, you still have to write it in this section of inclusion. So if the MLS says refrigerator, range, dishwasher, and microwave, you'd be like, oh, okay, they're on the MLS, they go with the house. Not necessarily. They're being offered on the MLS doesn't mean it's a contractual deal to that they have to go. If you don't write in there that you want those appliances for your buyer, then they might not go with the house. So you always want to be careful to make sure you include anything that your buyer is expecting to stay. And then if you get an offer and they write in something that your seller doesn't want to leave, like the garage or basement fridge or the washer and dryer, then obviously you would use a counter offer in order to negate that one item or any other items that you need to. And then exclusions, this is where, when we had the contract written for the chandelier house, they wrote excluded, dining room chandelier as shall go with the seller, shall not convey with the house, something like that. But like I said, we still had the expectation from the seller, from the buyer, that this dining room was going to look amazing because it had a $20,000 chandelier in it. The lease item section would be for things like security systems that could be leased, hot water tanks could be leased, propane tanks could be leased. There could be other leased items, and if they're not staying with the house, they need to be excluded from the contract right here. So I don't know if you've looked too many times at disputes and lawsuits that happen in contract law regarding real estate, but this section right here is responsible for a lot of it. And you just have to be really careful and make sure you over communicate. Another thing that gets people caught up a little bit is let's see, where's that at? The air conditioning thing. So if you read this, it says, this is what stays with the house: storm and screen doors and windows, awnings, blinds, and window air conditioners, whether now in or on the premises or in storage. So if you have a home that you're selling and it has window air, and the window air conditioners are not left with the house, that could become a sticking point. So either if the window air conditioners are not staying with the house, then you should list the house as no air. It doesn't have air. Because if you say it has window air, but you don't leave the air conditioners, it could be a problem because you're supposed to leave them. Even if it's wintertime and they're taken out and they're in a storage facility somewhere or sitting in the garage, they should stay with the house if you say that the property has window air. So you got to be careful with that. You should read over these, make sure you have a good understanding of what it says, what it means, and make sure that you can explain that to your seller and buyer as appropriate when the time comes. Let's see. I think that is about all that I have for tonight. I want to make sure that I leave enough time for you guys to ask any questions that you might have. And obviously, like I said, I don't have a live audience tonight, but if you need to reach me at any time, my contact information is gwarner@kingdomrealty.net or 740-412-0165. You can email me, you can call me, you can text me. I'll be happy to sit and discuss this with you. I also want to offer my services if you're writing an offer and maybe Mark's not available. I'd be happy to go through the contract with you, make sure that everything is good. I can look it over. I'm a managing broker with Red One, so that means I have the authority, the ability to look these contracts over. And so I'd be happy to do that for you at any time that you need. And we will pick up next time with section 6 under inspections and tests. And that will be the third contingency for a buyer in the contract. Hope you guys have a good night.